descending species is rare. Indeed, the fossil record is one of discontinuities. You know, you would almost think a creationist wrote this, seemingly documenting jumps and saltations from one type of organism to a different type. This raises a puzzling question. Why does the fossil record fail to reflect the gradual change one would expect from evolution? Maybe we shouldn't start with given the fact of evolution. Maybe this should drive our interpretation unless we're given to counterintuitive and mystifying explanations. Which then takes us then to the fossil record disappearance of living things. Well, the Bible says that organisms were created fully functional on days 3, 5, and 6 of creation. They should show up fully functional, fully complex. Of course, evolution says this, that the major differences should arrive after millions of years of evolution, during which, as Darwin said, the number of intermediates and transitional links should have been inconceivably great, which we already found out you don't find. But what does science say in regard to the appearance of living creatures in the fossil record? Evolution predicts this, that you should see a slow, gradual rise starting from similar types branching out over long, long periods of time to the numerous different diverse types and body plans over time in evolution. But what we actually find is at the lowest layers, we find the individual body plans showing up already. In other words, they appear first, and Darwin's tree of life is actually turned totally on its head. In fact, if you look at the major body plans, such as worms, sponges, clams, and vertebrates and stuff like that, you find this many appearing in the Cambrian record with their ancestors, 0. And you find this many out of the 47 documented filings showing up without any ancestors. 40 out of 47 appear out of nowhere, right in the fossil record. So on this point again, the Bible prevails. The appearance of life of all major life forms is this, and these are the words we should keep in mind. It's abrupt, it's discontinuous, it's extensive, and it shows up right from the beginning with mind-staggering complexity, right from the very beginning. What about those similarities? I mean, why else would you have similar bones in the arm of a human, a bat, a dog, or a frog, unless they evolved from a common ancestor? But this brings us to the fourth reason why evolution is scientifically invalid. Appeals to circularity. You interpret the data in an evolutionary context, and guess what? Voila! It comes out as evidence for evolution. Well, of course it would. I mean, why do we have these similar bones? It's because we have a common ancestor. And what is the evidence for a common ancestor? Similar bones. And I would suggest to you, listen carefully to all evolutionary arguments. I haven't found a one which isn't circular in nature. Appeals to events that have never been observed, appeals to mystifying explanation, appeals to extrapolations far beyond what the evidence will bear, and appeals to interpretations which are based on nothing but circular reasoning. But you know what? A lot of organisms have similar features which shouldn't have a common ancestor. Do you realize bats and whales have the exact same gene for echolocation? And as I read through the scientific paper, they said they were astounded that random genetic mutations had hit on the exact same genetic sequence down to the base. And it was just an amazing thing. And if you were to just look at that gene, bats and whales would pair together in an evolutionary tree. And they said, of course, but that isn't their real evolutionary cousins. So it doesn't fit the tree again. So how do they explain this? Through convergent evolution, not divergent from a common ancestor, but separate things converging on the same features. But do you know what convergent evolution is? It's a rhetorical rescuing device to salvage evidence which doesn't fit the evolutionary tree and force it into an evolutionary context. It's not something that's really there, that you really see in any ways. So how in the world do we know whether these similar features are due to a common ancestor or convergence? And why should we believe any of those explanations, either one of those? But what about those similarities in DNA? Now, this is a fascinating part. This is totally new. The Bible says common design, as Dr. Giberson mentioned. And we begin with these prepositions, that life is designed, as in Romans 1, life is discontinuous, and we're sharing this planet together. And so, just as in man-made things, you see a similar function, similar design, with similar plans, tools, materials, and environment, we would see the same thing with God-made things. Similar functions for have a similar design. Not just between that man and that woman that you see there, but between that horse, and that's actually a picture of me running a marathon last week, and me right there. Why do we have these similar features? This is great. In 1975, before we even had this great genetic sequencing capability, Dr. Henry Morris wrote, in the creation model, the same similarities are predicted on the basis of a common purposeful designer. We're looking for that common information that's going to underline the common design. From the evolutionary worldview, though, they have this tree of life. And this is what's amazing, because you're not going to hear this in the evolutionary story today. Ernst Mayr explained in 1963, much has been learned about gene physiology that makes it evident that the search for similar, the homologous genes is quite futile except in close relatives. So evolution did not predict these similarities before we could look back. In fact, they said because organisms have been evolving and the mutations have been happening, these creatures and these creatures, these diverse creatures, should have very, very different genetics. So here's a great opportunity. Before we have a way to test it, creationists made a prediction, evolutionists made a prediction. Two very different predictions. And what does the science say? Well, between 1978 and 1984, some phenomenal, groundbreaking papers were published in which they analyzed genes which were coding for incredibly almost entire structures, such as an eye. And these genes were called Hox genes. Well, evolutionary developmental biologist Sean Karl reports on it this way. He said, it was inescapable. Clusters of Hox genes shaped the development of animals as different as flies and mice. And now we know that includes just about every animal in the kingdom, including humans and elephants. The implications were what? Stunning. Disparate animals were built using not just the same kinds of tools, but indeed the very same genes. He goes on to say, the evolutionary lines that led to flies and mice diverged more than 500 million years ago. No biologist, catch this, no biologist had the foggiest notion that such similarities could exist between genes of such different animals. The Hox genes were so important that their sequence had been preserved throughout the enormous span of evolution. Stunning confirmation of the creationist prediction. We're looking for the information, and when the technology developed, we found the information. The common information for these common designs was right there in the Hox genes. And I'd like you to look carefully at that quote. Right at the very end, he makes a quick slip. You know that convergent evolution? It's dumped overboard. That firmly held belief in convergent evolution, completely gone, and now it's replaced with conservation. Now these genes are so important that they have survived 500 million years unchanged. And what's incredible is some evolutionists say, since we have similar genes as bacteria, some of these genes have survived for 3 billion years unchanged, while the rest of the genetics goes mutating on. Wow. That is a counterintuitive and mystifying explanation. And you know, it's kind of like this. Heads I win, tails you lose. Now, my brother did that to me when I was about 5 years old. He was flipping me for my Easter jelly beans. I wondered why he got every single one of those jelly beans, because he was doing the heads I win, tails you lose. That was just about the same time he told me that mom and dad really weren't my parents, but that I was bought at Goodwill for 50 cents and something there. Well, on this particular point, the Bible was right again. Common design information specifies similar design in organisms, and not only were the creationist predictions right, the evolutionary thinking in its prediction, based on a consistent view, was totally dead wrong. Totally dead wrong on this prediction. And what about that junk DNA? Junk DNA. Well, the Bible says that life is designed, but it also says that the creation is cursed in Genesis chapter 3. So we should expect, this is our prediction, we should expect some degeneration of DNA, but not wholesale junk DNA in your genome. And in fact, we should always search for function as we're doing research. These are two different ways of approaching research. One, your DNA is an incredible bioengineering marvel which should have function throughout it. Or two, it's cobbled together slowly by genetic mutations and should be filled up with junk that is shared between different kinds of organisms. Well, creationists look for those origins and functions. Here's a great paper by Jerry Bergman, published in the Creation Research Society, which is talking about the origins and genetic function of pseudogenes, genes that were supposedly broken and littering our DNA. We're looking for function for those pseudogenes. The evolutionist says that junk is all that separates us from the chimps. And they think that because you can find these so-called broken genes in your genome, that it's evidence for evolution and evidence against intelligent design. In fact, your favorite evolutionist and mine, Richard Dawkins, says the implications of the junk are like this. Pseudogenes, those supposedly broken genes that once did something useful, but have now been sidelined and are never transcribed or translated. What pseudogenes are useful is for embarrassing creationists, he says. He goes on to say it's a remarkable fact that greater than 95% of our DNA is basically junk and might as well not be there for all the difference it makes. Francis Collins goes on to say even more compelling evidence for common ancestor comes from the study of what are known as ancient repetitive elements, another type of junk. Mammalian genomes are littered with such AREs, with roughly 45%, he was asserting, of the human genome made of such genetic flotsam and jetsam. So he thinks it's junk. Of course, he can't really refute the creationist explanation that the evidence, of course, does not prove a common ancestor, even if you found junk, or even if it was functional from a creationist perspective. Such similarities could simply demonstrate that God used successful design principles over and over again. That would be my position. Of course, some might argue that these are actually functional elements. That's what I would say. Placed by the Creator for a good reason, of course. And discounting them as junk DNA just betrays our current level of ignorance. That would be my position. We should look for reasons for this junk DNA. Well, what does science say? Well, when Dr. Collins wrote that, there were already published in 2002 at least 13 known functions for those AREs, which he was saying were junk. But two major research projects reported out in 2007 and 2012 looking for functions of that so-called junk DNA, which was not coding for protein, found that hidden treasures in junk DNA. And the whole concept of junk DNA was being tossed overboard in paper after paper after paper, which were reporting on these findings. Creationists have reported on these findings. Are pseudogenes broken genes? They're not. And if you want a secular reference, grab this paper by Wynne. Pseudogenes are not pseudo anymore. In fact, the New York Times reports on bits of mystery DNA far from junk and they play a crucial role in your day-to-day function in life. And this is what the paper said. The system, though, is stunningly complex. The system of supposedly junk DNA is stunningly complex with many redundancies. It goes on to say just the idea of so many switches in this so-called junk DNA, over 4 million control switches operating your day-to-day function DNA. And it says what's almost incomprehensible. There is also a sort of DNA wiring system that is almost inconceivably intricate. One of the researchers on the Human Genome Project said, "It blows my mind to think of this complexity." What kind of complexity? 15 trillion bits of information. And 1 gram of your DNA would hold more information than 100 billion DVDs. And the evolutionists were completely wrong. They say biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of design. We would say, he said, what? Scripture is confirmed again. There is no evidence for wholesale junk DNA. What there is evidence for is an incredible designer who is far beyond anything we can even comprehend. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guliuzza. At this time, both of our speakers will each have an opportunity to give a 15-minute rebuttal. And so up first will be Dr. Giberson. You will have 15 minutes for your rebuttal.
Thank you, Randy, for that presentation. I want to make a few comments, which will be maybe a bit disorganized here because I've just got to go through some various things that he said, but I want to zero in on a few places where I think that he has misrepresented the way that, that scientists would approach the problem of origins. It's a very ingenious debating trick to sort of capture the debate by capturing the vocabulary and the definitions. And if we want to define science as something based on observation, testing, and repetition and eliminate everything that doesn't fit that definition from science, then there are a lot of things that people are being paid to do as professional scientists now that somehow mysteriously fall outside of science. There does not exist a simple boundary between science as practiced by doing observation, testing, and repetition, which is a very important part of science, and science which is done by examining historical episodes. Those two scientific enterprises are actually indistinguishable from each other. I'll give you a very simple example. I mean, when you observe the sun, you're actually observing the sun as it was 8 minutes ago. So are you doing origin science and studying the past history of the sun, or are you studying the sun? In fact, if you look at the hand in front of your face, there's a small gap between the time that the light leaves your hand and it hits your eye, and you are looking back in time a bit. If we go through the universe, we find many interesting things that take us way back in history. We find that when we look at the nearest star system, Alpha Centauri, it took several years for the light to reach us from Alpha Centauri. So are we studying that in terms of something which we are observing in the present, or are we studying the history of that? In 1572, Tycho Brahe saw a brand new star in the heavens. It was so bright that it was visible during the day. Now we now know that he saw a supernova, a star that exploded and became so incredibly bright that it was just mystifying to him. Now this was an event which happened millions of years ago. In 1604, Kepler saw a supernova, another event that happened millions of years ago. In 1987, in the southern hemisphere, another supernova was visible. Now, supernovas are very rare. Those are the only 3 that we've had in the last 600 years that you could see from the Earth. Now, those are unique events. Nobody can build a laboratory to repeat supernovas. Nobody can observe enough of them to say that we are doing repetitive observations on the same phenomena. And yet we have a very well-developed science of supernovas, and when the supernova in 1987 occurred, many theoretical ideas that had been developed based on predictions that come from the study of particle physics were tested and borne out and validated by the flux of odd particles that stream toward and through the Earth in the wake of that supernova. So when we look back into the past, we do science in exactly the same way that we do in the present. It's just that you can't go back into the past and repeat things. I mean, we can't go back and change the Big Bang into something different and see how things will turn out. We have to extrapolate based on theory. We can't go back and recreate our solar system and put the Earth in a slightly different spot to see what would happen there. But that doesn't mean that we can't study those things scientifically. Many things that are of great interest to us, like volcanoes today, for example. I mean, continental drift is something that occurs. I mean, there's so many things going on our planet that we cannot create laboratories to test them. So to restrict science to the investigation of things which can be observed, tested, and repeated is to try to place evolution and the Big Bang and the other scientific theories of origins outside history by definition. And I am unaware of any member of the scientific community who would define science in that particular way. Now, a second concern I have about Dr. Guliuzza's presentation is his odd identification of Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin and others as important Christian theologians. Now, these are men who want Christianity to go away and to die. And they would like, especially Lewontin and Dawkins, they would like to turn science into a weapon to make Christianity die faster and sooner. So it is in their interests to put a theological interpretation on everything that we know about science that makes that science incompatible with Christianity. So I want to suggest that we should not let these anti-religious atheists do our Christian theology for us. We should look instead to genuine Christian theologians who are not looking to science to destroy faith, but looking to science as a way to gain a more thorough understanding of God as creator. In my book, Oracles of Science, my co-author and I looked at this tendency of leading culture warriors in the battle for atheism and how they like to sort of fashion science into a philosophical weapon to be used against belief in God and against Christianity in particular. And in all cases, they extrapolate recklessly beyond what the scientific data can support. And in so doing, they become amateur, poorly informed, and I think unhelpful theologians that should be ignored. There is a lot of discussion in this conversation about the so-called normal meaning of Genesis. And I just want to make a couple of comments about how the normal meaning of Genesis might not be as simple a concept as we might think. I mean, as Christians, we grow up reading the Bible in English, and without thinking too hard about where it came from, we kind of read it as if it was kind of written sort of for us in our time. We kind of imagine that the language can easily be converted from Hebrew into English, and the meaning will stay the same, and we won't get confused and so on. But if we look very, very closely at the Genesis account, I think we see a lot of things in there that suggest to us that the normal meaning of Genesis may not be what comes so quickly off the page in English translations. So take, for instance, the majestic opening line. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, when I was a youngster reading that verse, I had seen episodes of Star Trek and so on, and so I pictured the earth as this nice planet, and the heavens as the place where the Enterprise was boldly going, where no one had gone before, and so on, and I thought God created that. Now, the Hebrew terms, however, for the heavens and the earth are actually the exact same terms for the land and the sky. Now, we often think of a handful of dirt as being a handful of earth, and so we still have that meaning. But there is no way that the opening verse in Genesis can possibly be referring to a planet. Nobody thought of the earth as a planet until the 17th century. A planet, and this is the literal meaning of the word, is a wandering star. A planet is an object in the heavens moving in an inexplicable and curious way that we can't understand. And the ancient Greeks wondered about the odd motion of Mars and Venus and Jupiter, and they called them wandering stars because they didn't move with the rest of the heavenly host. The earth was not a planet because the earth was not in the heavens and was not wandering about. It was fixed and at the center. So, to picture the proud round earth with its beautiful blue character and fluffy white clouds suspended in space as the meaning of the first verse in Genesis is to sort of rip that ancient Hebrew concept out of the time in which it was written and put it in a context several thousand years later, which is, I think, a very unreasonable disservice to that ancient text. If we read a little bit further in Genesis, we see that God creates a firmament. Now, this word firmament has caused a lot of puzzlement. Now, it turns out that the word that's translated as firmament actually means literally a bowl or a dome. And there are other places in the Old Testament where it talks about a firmament full of oil. Firmament, you can put salad in a firmament. The Hebrew word is rakia, and it means something that can be pounded out into a thin, solid metal shape. And we know from pictures that have come down to us and extra biblical accounts that this was the view that the ancient Israelites had of the heavens, and they weren't the only ones. Their neighbors shared this view. I mean, everybody thought that there was some kind of an inverted dome overhead. And if you go to a planetarium, I had my students in the planetarium in Boston just a week ago, you can see that if you put a dome over your head and you shine lights on it, it looks exactly like the night sky. So there's a very ordinary, everyday observational language being used there, that God has placed lights on this dome in the heavens, and that's what we see when we look up at night. There are additional clues in the Hebrew meaning of the starring characters in this story, Adam and Eve. I mean, we know people that have these names today, so we just think of them as regular, ordinary names, but the Hebrew word